Section 6 of Rambles in New Zealand by Carne Bidwill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswax Candle. Thursday, March the 29th. We were nearly all day doing what 4 hours good paddling in a canoe would have done, from the unwillingness of my crew. Our route was along the harbour of Tauranga, which extends for many miles to the northward, almost as far as Mercury Bay. It is a long, narrow and very shallow channel, formed by several flat islands lying close to the coast, and laid down on the charts as part of the mainland. Several rivers have their outlets into it, up one of which we went and encamped for the night. We found that a party from Matamata had occupied the place, which was the first ford of the river, just before us. We were glad to find them actually gone. They had, however, left such multitudes of fleas behind them that next morning I was a mass of red spots. It was a lesson to me afterwards never to occupy a deserted encampment of the natives. The cliffs we passed on this day's journey were very curious. They were about 20 or 30 feet from the water, and consisted of perfectly horizontal layers of a clay resembling chalk in appearance, but composed of decayed pumice, with occasional intervening layers of a black vegetable substance evidently passing into coal. One of the seams was about a foot thick. It was the under one, but had no consistency, and when pressed it crumbled in the hand so as to discover its component parts, which were leaves, twigs, and seed vessels of plants now forming the flowers of this island. This must be as recent a coal formation as may be seen in any part of the world. The natives said they used it as fuel, but they cannot do so to any extent, as the trouble of procuring it would be greater than would be required to get wood owing to its situation, at, or rather, below the edge of high water mark. Friday, March 30th. Our road today lay over a range of mountains called the Araho. The ascent on this, the eastern side, is gradual, but in many places on the other side almost a wall. The whole range was thickly wooded, denoting a very good quality of land. I here first saw the great Dracophyllum. It formed a small tree about 6 inches in diameter and 20 feet high. It is one of the most curious plants in the world. The leaves grow in tufts at the ends of the branches, just as in the dragon tree, Dracaena, and are of the same shape, but in this species they are elegantly reflexed, like the feathers of a soldier's plume. They are a foot long, and an inch broad at the base. The bunches of flowers, which I did not see, the plant being in seed, are, I believe, white, as large as moderate bunches of grapes, and of the same shape. I have very little doubt that it would grow outdoors in England, but could not succeed in getting any ripe seed. I also saw here for the first time the giant tree fern, mamuk, the young fronds of which are eaten by the natives, as well as the soft part of the head of the trunk, corresponding to the cabbage of the palm. In its natural state it is very slimy, so that if you bite it you will find some difficulty in spitting it out again, but by long baking in the native ovens it becomes of somewhat the consistency of baked apple, which would resemble in taste if it were at all acid. Nevertheless, it is by no means disagreeable. I measured some fronds 22 feet long, and at the base 8.5 inches in circumference. It far exceeds in beauty any other fern tree I have seen. The largest trunks were not more than 8 inches diameter. I was surprised to learn that fern trees are very easily transplanted. In fact, if cut off with an axe and the trunk buried about a foot, it will rarely fail of growing after a short time. This range of mountains was level at the top, and when viewed from a distance appeared like a wall. I however found it difficult to determine when we were on the highest part of the pass, as we traversed many minor hills and valleys while actually on the top of the range. I was at last much pleased to get a glimpse of a great plain to the westward, which showed at all events we had at length actually passed the highest part. I imagine this range to be about 4,000 feet high at the north end. It becomes very gradually lower towards the south, but still keeps its wall-like appearance. On this range, as well as on several high hills along the coast, there are very singular pillar-like rocks standing in groups on the summit. Some of them cannot be less than 100 feet high, and yet appear mere pillars. I regret that I was never able to approach any of them, so as to discover of what kind of rock they were composed. They always appeared to be completely covered with bushes, so that they could not be clusters of pillars of columnar basalt, which would have remained naked from the imperishability of its nature. At one point of today's journey on a narrow neck of land, which was far from being the highest, I saw the ocean to the eastward, where it appeared close beneath my feet, and westward, about 50 miles distance, at a place called Kawia or Kafia, for I do not know the correct orthography of the name, which is a very puzzling one to spell, as we have no letters to represent the peculiar blending of the R with some other sound before the W. It might as well be an H as an F, but most Europeans, to make the matter easy, call it at once Kafia. We met a party of about a dozen natives, chiefly women, who were going to join the tower. They said that the great party had left Matamata 3 days before, so that we were sure not to meet them. A piece of intelligence I confess I was not sorry to receive. Saturday, March 31st. Continued our descent of the mountain, and entered the great plain of the Thames, or Waiho, the most splendid piece of country I have met with for the purposes of colonization. This plain is, I should think, about 100 miles long and varying from 20 to 30 broad. It runs north and south, being bounded on the east by the perpendicular wall of the Aroha, and on the west by the mountains on the west coast. The River Thames runs through it, and is deep enough to be navigated by track boats or light steamers for a great distance. At the place I crossed it, it was about 5 feet deep and 100 yards wide. The stream is, however, so strong, in spite of the apparently perfect level of the country, that it would be useless to attempt ascending it by oars or sails. The whole plain, with very little exception, is clear of wood. It is abundantly watered, and would, I think, be one of the most splendid situations for a colony that can be found in the whole world. It must not be considered that this plain belongs to the river, for it is evident that such is not the case, as it is impossible so insignificant a river could have scooped out such a valley. The river, it is true, runs through it, but it is also formed in it by the innumerable streams which run off its mountainous barriers on both sides. It in fact takes its rise in the plain, and consequently could not have formed it. The body of the soil is, as are all the best soils in the country, decayed pumice. But in several parts, more especially on the east of the river, I saw large tracts covered with stones. These tracts, however, formed a mere trifle in comparison with the good parts. The chief fault of the plain at present is its excessive wetness. About one half is a complete marsh. But nothing would be easier than to drain it, and which ought to be done at very trifling expense, as there are deep watercourses running through the plain in all directions, much lower than the marshy spots, but they always have elevated banks which prevent their acting as drains for the portions of the land which they traverse. But as soon as the bank was cut through, the land would drain itself. The longest marsh we had to cross today was about 4 miles. The natives wanted to carry me, as they had previously done, but I was afraid of their falling with me and making me dirtier than I should be in wading through the mud without their assistance. I nearly stuck fast several times, and was obliged to tie my shoes with flax in order to keep them on my feet. The mud was in many places 3 feet deep, of a soft custard-like consistence, and of a light brown colour from the decomposed vegetable matter. I was heartily rejoiced when I was told we were near the end, when suddenly a bunch of reeds on which I had relied gave way, and I sunk up to my middle, so that I was obliged to call assistance to get out. After passing the marsh, we went through a grove of about 1 mile square of kaikotore and totara trees of enormous size. The kaikotoras were loaded with their beautiful scarlet and black fruit, which looked like a blaze of flowers. Here the natives brought me to a pool, saying that I ought to wash in order to be clean when we came to the pa, which was close by. I was much amused at this piece of vanity, which I humoured because it was agreeable to myself, and not that I cared how I looked on my arrival before the critics of Matamata. The natives, it was evident, did not like appearing as guides to a shabby fellow, and thought it would raise their consequence with their friends if I looked more like a great man than was usually the case with their visitors. Matamata is situated on a slight elevation in the middle of the plain, and is a pa of some consequence. Its chief defence, besides the stockades, consists in the marshes which almost surround it. There was a mission establishment at Matamata, or as the missionaries call it, Mata Mata. but it was abandoned in consequence of the bad conduct of the natives who robbed the resident missionary, Reverend A. M. Brown, now of Tauranga. They are now very desirous of persuading the missionaries to return, but do not deserve to succeed. In consequence of the war party having drained the population, there were none but old men, young women, and children in Matamata. The women were the best-looking set I ever saw. They were almost all strikingly handsome. The natives of this place have a very indifferent character, so that although it is many years since white men first visited it, there was but one resident at this time, and he was from home. As it is one of the best places in the island for buying pigs, it is evident there must be some truth in the reports of their bad propensities, or more persons would venture there to secure so good a harvest. The native who had charge of this man's house permitted us the free use of it, as if it had been his own. It was a terribly ruinous place, built many years since, when Matamata was a great mart for flax. In the plains near, I saw the finest specimens of the flax plant I ever met with. They were at least 12 feet high, covered miles of the plain, and were growing in all the moist places not actually bog. The people brought large baskets full of the berries of the Kaikatora, Dacrydium excelsum, for sale. I bought them at the rate of 1 inch of tobacco for a bushel. These berries are very like those of the yew, but not slimy. They are good tasted, and form a great part of the food of the natives during the season in those places where the trees are abundant. They are produced in such quantities as to give the trees a scarlet appearance. April 1st. Began to retrace our steps towards Tauranga. The first few miles were over the same road we had before travelled. Several natives who were going to join the tower accompanied us. I was much amused at seeing their wives cross the river. I had crossed before they arrived, making a gigantic chief carry my clothes in order to keep them dry. I dressed and sat down on the bank to await the arrival of the rest of the party. When the women came, they loosened their mats, and then stooped down at the edge of the water onto which they walked, still stooping as to show nothing but their knees. As they got into deeper water, they gradually straightened themselves until at last they were chin-deep, still holding their mats above their heads. When they got to the shallow part on the other side, they again began to stoop, and at last dropped their mats in their proper place, and stepped ashore, appearing as much diverted as I was at the great pains they were taking to preserve decency. The men had no such difficulty, for they coolly stripped and walked into the water just as if no woman had been present. We encamped at the foot of the mountain, near a waterfall which had been conspicuous for the last 2 days, and close to the place where Mr. Platt was robbed, as he reported the committee of the House of Lords, and left to find his way home to Tauranga in his shirt. The tower had made this a resting place, and there were sheds enough erected to accommodate about 500 men. The place, as usual, was swarming with fleas. The encampment was put up without much regard to order. The greater part of it consisted of sheds about 4 feet high, open on one side and very long. One was 150 feet, and just wide enough for a man to lie across. It was exceedingly cold, and wood was very scarce, the war party having consumed every bit that could easily be procured. The mountain rose almost perpendicularly behind us, and was bare for a small distance from each side of the path. Everywhere else it was thickly clothed with wood. The river from the waterfall which I have before spoken of ran within 50 yards of our feet in a deep ravine, the sides of which were more thickly covered with fern trees than I ever saw before. I think that the glowing terms in which many speak of the ferns are not borne out by their general appearance. It is only when seen from above that they are such surpassingly beautiful objects. Seen from below, I do not think they are equal in beauty to the generality of palms. While the supper was cooking, I tried to reach a waterfall in the vicinity of our resting place, but was benighted on the mountain, and should probably have lost my way had it not been for the fires of the party below me. I got far enough to see that the only possible way to reach the edge of the fall would be to walk down the bed of the river. For how great a distance I could not then tell, but was determined to try the next morning. April 2nd. The natives informed me that the river crossed the road we should travel today at no great distance from the fall, so I accepted of their guidance in preference to hunting out a more direct route through the wood. About half a mile after reaching the edge of the wood, on the top of the hill, we found the river, which was about 50 feet wide and knee-deep. I waded down it until I reached the edge of the fall, which is at least 500 feet perpendicular, and although not a fall of much consequence, so far as the amount of water is concerned, it is the largest I have seen in New Zealand. And indeed, were it in Europe, it would be considered well worth travelling many miles to see. I was much astonished at so considerable a stream running from what appeared so narrow a ridge of land, for seen from the plain, the Araho range appears a mere wall. It was not until I had travelled for the whole day on nearly level land across the range that I could believe myself so much deceived. Every quarter hour as I went on I expected to get a glimpse of the sea, but did not reach the other declivity until about 4 p.m. The whole of the range is thickly timbered, and the soil good and well watered with small streams. The ascent from the land, west side, is unfortunately nearly impracticable for carriages of any description, but on the sea, east side, it is much more gentle. The road was dreadfully bad, owing to the passage of so large a body of men over the soft clayey soil, and in so narrow a path, for they must have travelled, as usual, in single file. At the edge of the fall, I was astonished by a splendid view of the whole range of Tongariro, consisting of 5 peaks all covered with snow. They lay nearly south-southwest of this place, which, compared with its relative position, ascertained previously by me, of east by north of Cape Egmont, when as at Tongariro, Cape Egmont bore west by south, will give its exact position. Tongariro seemed at a great distance, looking like a mere white cloud, for which it might easily have been taken but for its distinct outline. As we passed on our road today, the marks of the passage of the war party became more and more recent, and we expected momentarily to overtake some of them, but fortunately did not. We encamped by the side of a stream close to the place where we emerged from the wood, on the bare tract of land which skirts the sea-coast in this part of the country. Some of my natives went on to see where the tower was, and reported that it was over the hill at the bottom of which we were encamped. I was rather alarmed at this news, thinking they might come back and rob us in the morning in order to get themselves into practice for their intended exploit at Makatu. They did not, however, molest us, and we passed the night in quietness. April 3rd. We were now not above 6 or 7 miles from Tauranga, or at least from Otamoiti, the place from which I had started, but it was impossible to get there without passing through the war party, and I pushed on, more than half expecting to be robbed and perhaps stripped. We came up with it at a creek which we had occasion to cross. They had encamped on the other side of this water, and we were obliged to ask them for a canoe to cross it in. About twice as many as were wanted immediately started with 2 canoes, and I was compelled to divide my things between them in order to prevent a quarrel, which they seemed much disposed to pick if possible. I became more comfortable, however, when I saw among the crew of one of the boats a chief of Monutapu, whom I had seen at Tauranga and knew to be a very good fellow. On landing, I was immediately surrounded by all the rabble of the party, and had hard work to keep my temper with them. The chiefs, as usual, said nothing and kept aloof, but the mob of slaves and boys began to twitch my clothes and gun as I passed along, and make all kinds of impertinent remarks. However, I walked on as fast as I could under the guidance of my Monutapu friend, and after about a mile got rid of all the most determined of my persecutors. We then came to another creek, much wider than the last, where I was carried across on the shoulders of one of the natives. Here I lost my 2 best men, Mahia and Moneo, who were detained by their friends to have a howl, according to their custom of showing gladness when they meet. I was very sorry that these fellows had stayed behind, because, being the steadiest and most trustworthy of my followers, I had given them my dried plants to take care of, and I thought it too much to expect that they would be able to prevent such a prize as a dozen quires of cartridge paper from being distributed amongst their friends. I consequently gave up as lost my much-prized specimens, and was proportionately overjoyed when I saw them enter Otamoiti about 2 hours after me, with their loads quite safe. People in England imagine that splendid specimens of carving are common among the New Zealanders, but such is far from the case. The only specimen I met with in the country which I thought worth having was a paddle I saw today. It was most beautifully carved all over the blade, and I tried to buy it, and even offered 10 pounds of tobacco for it, but without success. It was taboo, and I dare say the value of 100 pounds would not have bought it at this time, as it was, I understood, connected in some way with the present war. While crossing one creek, where we had to wade above half a mile, a native told me one of the women was tattooed behind like the men. I asked her if it was the case, and she said yes, and that if I would wait and let her get on a little ahead, she would show it, which she accordingly did, to my great edification. It is a very rare thing for women to be tattooed anywhere but about the lips and chin, and this was quite a curiosity. I used to think it rather ornamental in the men, but what its use can be in a woman I cannot imagine, as they are always covered. The women are quite often covered with blue marks, which might be called tattooing in England. It is the same kind as sailors are so fond of pricking into their arms, but it is a totally different thing from the elaborate engraving on a New Zealander's face or rump, inasmuch as in one case the skin is cut and remains in the same pattern as the stains, and in the other the marks do not at all affect the smoothness of the skin. I have seen the arms and bodies of the New Zealand women so covered with these powerful blue marks that they looked as if they had on them a tight-fitting, figured chintz dress. April 4th. The war party do not seem much inclined to fight. They have been a fortnight advancing a distance which ought to have been easily travelled in 2 days. They did not reach Otamoiti until this evening, and will, I am happy to say, leave it early tomorrow morning, in order to save the tide, as did they not leave at the time of low water, they would have about 12 miles further to march. Although the war party are perfectly friendly with the Tauranga tribe, and in fact are at present fighting the battles of the latter, yet the white people residing at Tauranga are not quite comfortable, and have taken all possible precautions to prevent robbery, even to the locking of their stockades, and securing in them such bulky articles as canoes and boats, which would otherwise have been very probably taken away or destroyed. I saw this evening a grand war dance, and certainly think it would be sufficient to strike terror into the heart of any man. Imagine a body of about 3,000 nearly naked savages, made as hideous as possible by paint, standing in close ranks, and performing a sort of recitative of what they would do with their enemies if they could lay hold of them. They stood in 4 close lines, one behind the other, with the solitary leader, as it appeared, in front at the right end of the line. This leader was a woman who excelled in the art of making hideous faces, viz. Bokun. The feet had but a small part of the work to perform, as they did not break their lines, but merely kept up a kind of stamp in excellent time with one foot. Their arms and hands had plenty to do, as they were twisted into all possible positions to keep tune with the recitative. Their eyes all moved together in the most correct time it is possible to conceive, and some of the performers possessed the power of turning them so far downwards that only the whites were visible. This was particularly the case with the woman whom I have spoken of as the leader. She was a remarkably handsome woman when her features were in their natural state, but when performing she became more hideous than any person who has not seen savages can possibly imagine. She was really very much like some of the most forbidding of the Hindu idols, the resemblance to a statue being rendered more perfect by the pupilless eyes, the most disagreeable part of sculpture. The words of their song I could not get a translation of, but I understood that they merely described how they would kill and eat their enemies, as well as the attack, the firing of muskets, etc. The intonation could hardly be considered musical, but they would repeat a number of words in a short staccato manner, and then dwell on one with a general hiss, which would make one's blood run cold. At other times the sound would be still more horrid, but one that it is impossible to describe. It was not, according to my idea, a yell, but something far more dreadful. One of their hisses, however, reminded me of the sound of returning ramrods, when well performed by a large body of soldiers. I can only describe the manner in which the words were repeated by supposing they were recording to the time of a piece of music, but all in one note, for all the different hisses, groans, audible shudders, etc., could hardly be represented by any kind of musical intervals. The whole performance was so perfectly horrid that although I am possessed of strong nerves, I could not repress a shudder, and my hair almost stood on end, and I certainly felt very glad that I was on a different side of the power from them. The whole performance took up about an hour. Afterwards they had some speechifying, and then they separated. I believe they have these war dances, etc., in order to keep up their courage to the sticking point, as they're such cowards that would never fight without some such adventitious excitement. The next morning they had all left Otamoiti, and had reached Monotapu, another village about 2 miles off, where they stayed all the time I was at Tauranga. The missionaries used every endeavour to prevent their going on to Makatu, but were unsuccessful. I afterwards heard that they never really did reach that place, and consequently there was no fight after all their grand preparations, proving that I was right when I thought they were not half inclined for it, or they would have moved on rather more rapidly than 5 miles a day. In fact, I believe they stopped at Monatapu in purpose to allow the missionaries to persuade them not to go on. I embarked on board the schooner Columbine belonging to the mission, and after a stormy passage of 3 days, arrived in the Thames. I do not know whether the autumns are always so cold in this part of the world, but this one was dreadfully so. I am certain that a cruise along the south coast of England in October would be far more pleasant than this one of mine. We all kept in the cabin during the whole passage, or if we did make our appearance on deck, were always cloaked up as much as we could. My opinion of the climate of New Zealand during the time I was there would be summed up by the word raw. I certainly think that rawness is the principal characteristic of the air of that country. Not so much, however, in winter as in summer and autumn. I have no doubt there will be quite sufficient heat for any crops which come to perfection in England, and perhaps France, but I do not think the wines, etc., would ever have the richness of those of Spain or Madeira. From all my observations at the Thames, where I remained some weeks, I think it is the proper place for a settlement, except perhaps Port Nicholson. It is certainly the most desirable situation in the island. Port Nicholson I have never seen, but from what I have heard of it, I am inclined to think it must be a more advantageous situation, geographically considered, than even the Thames. I do not know whether the land about Port Nicholson is as mountainous and barren as it usually is on the coast, but should suppose from the geological formation in which it is situated, if any level land is to be found in the country, it will be in that neighbourhood. I know that coal exists in the neighbourhood, if not actually there, and that would be an additional advantage over the Thames, where there are none but volcanic rocks. At the Thames I first saw the pine, or kauri, which does not grow to the southward of that place. It is always a sign of bad land, and grows so sparingly, even in those places where it is found, that I am inclined to think in 10 years New Zealand planks and spars will be more scarce than they are at present. Independently of the rarity of the tree, a great drawback to its value is that it only grows on the tops and sides of steep hills, from whence it is very difficult to transport. At present the supply is obtained from the most inaccessible spots, the sides of hills next to the sea and rivers. And even now these situations are becoming quite denuded of their timber, and I am sure that 20 ships a year would quite exhaust the supply of kauri in 10 years or less, or at all events that part of the supply which could be got at so easily as to be profitable for exportation. There are not many anchorages in the Thames, and but 3 places which can be considered harbours. The one called Coromandel Harbour is undoubtedly the most eligible situation, unless hereafter some other harbour shall be found higher up in the Firth, as it is called. The shores are all very rocky and covered with trees, but the cliffs are not in general high, and are always very rugged. Those at the water's edge are covered with oysters in a most extraordinary manner. Generally they are more than a foot thick and very good. Other shellfish are also abundant, particularly cockles. Of these I have seen more than a man could carry collected by one woman during the space of a tide. Scallops are also tolerably abundant, and are most delicious eating. There are no lobsters or crabs, but a great abundance of fish of all kinds. One, the salmon of the English, or kahwai, is a most excellent fish, the best I have tasted in the southern hemisphere. It is about the size of a salmon, and so like it in figure, fins, etc., that I should think it must belong to an allied family. Flatfish are also more abundant than they usually are on these coasts, but I have never tasted any equal even to a plaice. All the fish in New Zealand are much superior to those in New Holland, which indeed they can easily be, for such a set of wretched, tasteless things of those of the latter I did not believe could have been found. The natives about the Thames are not numerous, but a very bad set, great thieves and very impudent. One of the largest canoes ever seen is now in the great par at the Thames, Waikatiwai. It is 88 feet long and highly finished. It belongs to a Bay of Islands chief who came down to the Thames to fight and got beaten. I believe he was a great rascal. At least, so say all the whites. A great many persons have lately been buying land at the Thames. The first who came with the real intention of employing themselves in agriculture were 2 old settlers from New South Wales, of the names Thorpe and Prout, who disposed of their concerns there and emigrated to New Zealand. I do not think they have done wisely, but they are the best judges of their own affairs. At the upper part of the firth the land is low, but at the mouth of the river the water gets too shallow for the approach of ships of any size. The Waiho, of which I have already spoken, is a missionary settlement. The land is low, and if the water were deeper, it would be a splendid place for a first settlement, as it would immediately lead to the largest tract of level land in the country. In fact, I believe the only large tract of level land in the whole island. On the north coast of the firth is another missionary station, that of Mr. Paynham. This person claims nearly the whole of the north coast, a tract about 30 miles square, independently of the land around Manukau Harbour on the west coast, a place which has been very much talked of in all the books that have yet been written on the country. This celebrity has risen from the fact that the extreme narrowness of the land at the head of the Manukau. The frontage is certainly not half a mile, but I believe, from all the information I can collect, that Manukau is a very useless place, as it is full of sandbanks and has a bar at its entrance, which almost precludes the possibility of entering, though the books say the contrary. I never met with one person in New Zealand who did not give it the character I have above described. Should it not be the case, it would be a place of great consequence and time. It is perhaps the narrowest isthmus in the world, or at all events the narrowest joining two such large tracts of land. The length of coast to the north is not enough to prevent a vessel from sailing around, in preference to coming through a canal at Manukau, should there ever be one. For the sailor, I think, might generally calculate upon a greater loss of time in going through the canal than sailing around the land. Although the tract of land claimed by Mr. Paynham is in all probability the largest, being about 1,000,000 acres, yet several missionaries claim tracts of from 100,000 to 600,000 acres in different parts of the country. It would be ridiculous for any government to recognise such claims, which would prevent the sale of government lands while any of these tracts remained unsold, as it would be for the interests of the holders to sell for less than the government price. The colony would be in fact swamped, just in the same manner as was Swan River by Mr. Peel's grant. I imagine almost all the land to the northward of the Thames is claimed by Europeans. Many tracts have 5 or 6 claimants, and I know of people in New South Wales having spent as much as £600 at a time in the purchase of those lands from one of the claimants, in thorough ignorance of the validity or even the reasonableness of one claim over another, supposing, of course, that any were valid. The cause of these disputes has sometimes been the dishonesty of Europeans in selling the same land to different individuals, but more frequently from the natives having done so. Not always dishonestly, as, according to their notion of titles, and see report of House of Lords Committee, a totally different tribe may consider that they have an indisputable title to the same land that has been sold by another tribe only 2 years before, because in the interim they may have cleared and planted with potatoes, or otherwise occupied it for 1 whole year without interruption. This can only apply to lands which are far from the usual haunts of any tribe, but almost all the large tracts purchased by Pakehas are lands thus situated, for the Maoris would never sell lands near their settlements for sufficiently low prices to induce Europeans to become purchasers of more than enough for the sites of their houses, gardens, etc. In 2 purchases which I saw made, one at Tauranga and the other at Rotorua, the prices given were preposterous and could only have been submitted to by the purchasers because they could not do without the land. The spot at Tauranga was not above 50 feet square, and the cost of it not less than £50 in trade. That at Rotorua was about half an acre of water frontage and cost £12 10 shillings. But the first was in the middle of a pa, while the other was only near one, and had always been used by the purchaser as a landing place to his residence ever since he had been at Rotorua. He told me he considered himself very lucky to get it even for that sum, as he had been trying for years to buy it without success, and even this land did not appear to me to be a perfectly free purchase, for there were on it 2 spots which were taboo, and from which I was called back in great haste by the missionary lads for fear I should be seen there and stripped for my infraction of their laws. This was actually within 100 yards of the house of a missionary. The natives always require an additional consideration for taking off the taboo, or making noa, any places which may be included in a purchase. Could not discover if the taboo was lost by lapse of time, but suppose it must be so by reason of the forgetfulness of the people, for as they dare not approach these prohibited places so as to renew the marks of prohibition, the original marks, sometimes a bundle of rags, sometimes a bit of human flesh or other perishable article, become lost, and in time the places are again approached and built upon, for they are generally the sites of houses or the like places. Were it not for something of this kind, these places must have been much more numerous than they are, although even now they are sufficiently so to be very disagreeable to a stranger. End of section 6.